At almost any moment in history, people believed they were living close to the end of the world, not in the distant future, but within their own lifetime, as if time itself was running out. This feeling appeared long before modern technology or global news existed, when villages were small, travel was slow, and most people never left the land where they were born. Even then, farmers, hunters, and priests felt that their era was unstable, broken, or different from everything that came before, as if something important was ending. What makes this strange is that the same belief appeared in cultures that never met, spoke different languages, and lived on opposite sides of the world. Some believed the sky would fall, others feared the sun would disappear, while many thought their gods would soon reset the world and begin a new age. These ideas were not always loud or dramatic, and many people accepted them calmly as part of how the world was supposed to work. Ancient humans did not see time as a straight line moving forward, but as a cycle that repeated again and again without clear beginning or end. Seasons returned, stars followed fixed paths, floods came and left, and life itself moved in patterns that felt predictable and circular. When everything important followed cycles, the idea that the world itself could end did not feel frightening, but expected. If a cycle existed, then it made sense that it would eventually reach its final moment before starting again. This way of thinking shaped how people understood disasters, wars, and sudden changes in their lives. A drought was not just a lack of rain, but a sign that balance was breaking and the cycle might be closing. Wars and disease were not random events, but warnings that the current age was becoming unstable and weak. When many problems appeared at the same time, people did not think something was wrong temporarily, but that the world itself was changing. Believing the end was near gave meaning to confusion and suffering when no other explanation seemed to fit. If the world was ending, then pain had a purpose and chaos was part of a larger story. This belief helped people survive uncertainty, even when the ending never actually arrived. Strangely, this pattern never disappeared and continued to return again and again throughout human history. Every generation felt that their time was unique, fragile, and standing at the edge of something final. To understand why this belief never fades, we must look deeper into how humans experience time and uncertainty itself. Ancient people did not measure time to plan progress, but to understand their place inside a repeating world where change felt slow, heavy, and often beyond human control. Days were shaped by sunlight and shadow, while years were understood through seasons that returned again and again, teaching people that nothing important moved in a straight line. Because time felt circular, the future did not feel endless or open, but limited, like a path that would eventually curve back toward its beginning. Many cultures believed the world had already ended before, long before they were born, and that their lives existed inside a later repeating age. This made endings feel familiar rather than shocking, because destruction was seen as part of renewal instead of a final collapse. Calendars were not tools for predicting the future, but systems for recognizing patterns that had already happened many times before. When something disrupted those patterns, it felt meaningful, not random, as if time itself was sending a warning. An eclipse, a strange storm, or a failed harvest was not just an event, but a sign that balance might be breaking. People feared falling out of rhythm with time more than they feared individual disasters. Staying aligned with cycles meant survival, while disorder felt dangerous and unnatural. This mindset shaped how ancient societies understood fate, responsibility, and the limits of human power. The world was not expected to improve forever, only to last until its cycle was complete. When change accelerated, people felt they were approaching that completion. This is why crisis often felt like an ending rather than a temporary disruption. Understanding time this way made prophecies feel logical instead of mystical. The future was not predicted but recognized when patterns repeated too closely. This way of thinking spread naturally across civilizations that never met. They were responding to the same human need for meaning and uncertainty. And that need would shape every prophecy that followed. Sudden change has always felt dangerous to humans, because for most of history, stability meant survival, while rapid shifts often appeared before hunger, violence, or the loss of familiar protection. When old rules stopped working, people rarely believed the situation was temporary. Instead, they felt the world itself was becoming unstable, as if something fundamental was breaking. A failed harvest, a new ruler, strange weather, or social disorders often arrived together, making separate problems feel like one large collapse rather than unrelated events. Humans naturally search for patterns, so when many changes happened at once, the mind connected them into a single explanation instead of seeing them as coincidence. Ancient people did not think in terms of progress, so change rarely felt like improvement. It felt like decline, loss, or the weakening of an age. Believing the world was ending helped people organize fear, turning uncertainty into a story with meaning instead of chaos without explanation. An ending felt easier to understand than an open future, because it placed suffering inside a final chapter rather than endless confusion. This reaction was not foolishness, but a mental survival strategy shaped by generations who lived without control over large forces. During times of crisis, people naturally looked for voices that could explain what was happening, because uncertainty felt more dangerous than bad news with clear meaning. Prophets did not appear because people wanted fear, but because they wanted direction when familiar rules stopped working and old answers no longer helped. A person who could connect events into a single story quickly gained attention, even if that story was unsettling rather than comforting. Warnings felt useful because they offered preparation instead of confusion, giving people something to hold onto when control felt lost. These figures often spoke in symbols and images, allowing listeners to see their own fears, reflected without needing exact predictions. Because symbols were flexible, the same warning could survive changing conditions and still feel relevant over time. Prophecies spread fastest when they matched emotions people already felt, rather than introducing new ideas from nowhere. Crisis did not create belief from nothing, but amplified thoughts that were already present beneath the surface. Across the world, civilizations that never met each other still imagined the end of time in strangely similar ways, even though their environments and beliefs were very different. This similarity did not come from shared knowledge, but from shared human experience shaped by uncertainty, loss, and rapid change that felt overwhelming. When societies faced drought, famine, disease, or war, people searched for explanations that felt larger than daily problems. Small struggles rarely created prophecies, but long periods of instability made ordinary life feel unsustainable and fragile. In those moments, imagining an ending helped people explain why familiar systems no longer protected them. Ancient cultures often believed their gods controlled cycles of creation and destruction rather than permanent stability. If the world had been created once, it could also be unmade and reshaped again. This idea appeared in myths from different regions, not because they copied each other, but because cycles felt natural. Floods, fires, and storms regularly erased parts of the world, making total destruction feel possible rather than abstract. When people saw nature reset itself, it felt logical that history could reset as well. Civilizations that depended on agriculture were especially sensitive to signs of collapse because food failure threatened survival directly. A few bad seasons in a row could make the future feel shorter and more uncertain. As fear grew, stories about endings offered meaning instead of helplessness. Believing collapse was part of a larger plan reduced the pain of not being able to stop it. Different cultures described different endings, but the emotional core stayed the same. Some imagined fire, others water, darkness, or silence, but all described a final breaking of order. These images reflected local fears rather than universal truth. Despite differences, the idea that the world moved toward an ending felt intuitive everywhere. Human memory is shaped by loss more than stability, making decline easier to imagine than continuity. Stories of endings survived because they felt emotionally true even when they were never fulfilled. They explained suffering in a way daily explanations could not. Over time, these stories became traditions rather than predictions. They were passed down not as warnings to escape, but as reminders of fragility. Each generation reshaped the story to fit its own fears and uncertainties. This is why similar endings appeared again and again without ever arriving. Throughout history, predicted end-of-the-world dates almost never arrived as expected, yet belief rarely disappeared because fear did not vanish when a specific moment passed. When nothing happened, people did not feel relief for long since uncertainty remained, and without a clear explanation, the future felt open, unstable, and emotionally unsafe. To protect meaning, failed dates were often reinterpreted as symbolic, misunderstood, or delayed, allowing belief to survive without forcing people to admit they were wrong. This adjustment was not deception for many followers, but a way to preserve emotional stability during times when life already felt fragile and unpredictable. Dates gave fear a shape, turning anxiety into something measurable, something that could be waited for instead of endlessly imagined. When the date passed, confusion appeared, but the original reasons for fear remained unresolved, making a new date feel necessary rather than absurd. Many cultures tied new predictions to numbers, celestial movements, or calendar cycles, because these felt external and trustworthy. Eclipses, comets, and calendar transitions provided moments that seemed meaningful enough to justify updated timelines. Even as knowledge increased, emotional habits stayed the same, because people searched for certainty more than accuracy during unstable periods. Updating the date allowed communities to maintain shared meaning without confronting the discomfort of uncertainty alone. The ending did not disappear. It simply moved forward, staying close enough to feel real. As long as fear existed, belief adapted instead of fading. Almost every generation feels that it lives in a moment unlike any before, where familiar rules no longer work, and the future feels fragile and uncertain in a new way. People compare the present only to their own memories, not to centuries of past crises that feel distant, abstract, and emotionally quiet by comparison. When change accelerates, daily life feels unstable, making people believe the world itself is shifting rather than simply adapting to new conditions. Ancient communities felt this during sudden climate changes, when reliable seasons failed and survival routines no longer provided safety or predictability. Later societies experienced the same feeling during wars, invasions, and the collapse of political systems that once felt permanent and unshakable. In each case, people believed they were witnessing something final, not just another chapter in a repeating pattern. The past rarely feels as threatening because it no longer demands immediate decisions or emotional response from the present mind. Memory softens old disasters, turning them into stories rather than lived danger, while current problems feel sharp and overwhelming. This contrast makes the present feel heavier, more urgent, and closer to an ending than anything remembered before. When people feel disconnected from long history, they lose perspective on how often similar moments have already passed. Without that perspective, fear grows faster and explanations become simpler, often pointing toward collapse rather than adaptation. Each generation sees its struggles clearly, but views past struggles as resolved, forgetting how uncertain they once felt. This creates the illusion that modern problems are uniquely severe and impossible to survive. As fear grows, people search for larger meaning to explain why life feels unstable all at once. The idea of an ending offers clarity when the future feels too complex to understand piece by piece. Believing time itself is running out turns confusion into a single story instead of many unanswered questions. This belief also reduces responsibility, because collapse feels inevitable rather than influenced by human choices. Across history, moments of rapid change have always produced the same emotional response, regardless of era or culture. People mistake unfamiliar change for unprecedented danger, even when history shows similar transitions occurred before. Technology, politics, and beliefs may change, but emotional reactions remain surprisingly consistent. Every generation feels different because it experiences fear firsthand rather than through distant records. This firsthand experience gives the present an intensity the past can never match. As long as humans live inside uncertainty, each era will feel like the edge of something final. The belief does not come from evidence, but from emotion shaped by immediacy. And that is why the feeling of living at the end of time never truly disappears. When fear became widespread and constant, religion often provided a framework that helped people organize anxiety into something understandable and shared rather than personal and overwhelming. Religious stories did not remove danger from the world, but they gave it context, explaining why suffering existed and what role it played inside a larger cosmic order. For many ancient societies, believing events were guided by higher forces reduced the feeling that chaos was random or meaningless. If disasters were part of a divine plan, then fear felt purposeful instead of arbitrary, making life easier to endure. Religions often describe time as divided into ages, each with a beginning, a period of decline, and a final transformation. This structure matched how people already experienced life, reinforcing beliefs that the world moved toward an ending rather than endless continuation. Rituals and traditions created stability during uncertain periods, offering repeated actions that made time feel predictable again. Even when daily life felt unstable, religious calendars restored rhythm through festivals, fasts, and shared observances. Prophecies were rarely specific instructions for survival, but reminders that suffering was temporary and meaningful. The promise of renewal after destruction softened fear, because endings were not final, but transitions into something new. Communities that shared these beliefs felt less isolated because fear was experienced together rather than individually. Shared belief turned anxiety into social bonding, strengthening groups during periods when external threats increased. Religious leaders often became interpreters of uncertainty, translating confusing events into familiar moral or spiritual language. This reduced panic because people felt someone understood what was happening and could explain it. Stories of judgment or cleansing framed collapse as correction rather than failure. If the world was ending due to moral imbalance, then meaning could still be found in behavior and belief. These ideas encouraged reflection instead of despair, even when circumstances were harsh. Religion did not invent fear of endings, but it shaped how fear was expressed and managed. Different cultures developed different symbols, yet the emotional function remained similar everywhere. Endings became less terrifying when placed inside sacred narratives that promised continuity beyond collapse. This allowed people to live with uncertainty without constant dread. Even failed prophecies did not fully weaken belief because the structure itself remained comforting. Religion offered stability when evidence did not. As long as fear existed, belief systems adapted to hold it. This relationship between fear and meaning would continue shaping history far beyond ancient times. Stories about the end of the world have always spread faster than ordinary news because they speak directly to fear, uncertainty, and the feeling that something important is slipping away. When people feel unsure about the future, they pay more attention to information that explains why life feels unstable rather than information that offers slow or complex answers. Apocalyptic stories are simple, emotional, and memorable, making them easy to share and repeat even in societies without writing or mass communication. These stories often reduce complicated problems into a single cause, allowing people to feel they understand what is happening instead of feeling lost. Fear sharpens attention, so messages connected to danger are remembered longer and passed on more eagerly than calm explanations. Ancient storytellers understood this instinctively, shaping warnings that stayed alive through repetition rather than accuracy. A story about survival or ending felt more important than stories about routine life because it seemed to carry urgent meaning. Apocalyptic ideas also created shared emotional experiences, uniting people through a common fear rather than separating them. When many people believed the same ending was near, individual anxiety felt lighter because it was no longer faced alone. This shared belief made stories powerful even when details were vague or symbolic. The lack of clear dates or exact events allowed stories to adapt to different moments and cultures without losing relevance. As conditions changed, the story changed slightly, staying useful instead of becoming outdated. This flexibility made apocalyptic narratives surprisingly durable across centuries. People rarely questioned these stories deeply during crisis because questioning removed emotional protection. Belief offered certainty when daily life offered none. Even skepticism struggled to compete with fear that felt emotionally true. Stories about endings also offered moral clarity, dividing the world into meaningful categories of right and wrong. This clarity felt comforting during times when rules and expectations seemed broken. The faster fear spread, the stronger the story became. Over time, these narratives embedded themselves into cultural memory rather than remaining simple warnings. They became part of how societies explained collapse, loss, and sudden change. The story survived even when predictions failed. What mattered was not whether the ending arrived, but whether the story continued to feel useful. As long as uncertainty returned, apocalyptic stories returned with it. When a prophecy about the end of the world fails, belief rarely disappears, because fear does not vanish simply because a date has passed without visible consequences. For people already living with anxiety and instability, belief provides structure, and losing that structure can feel more dangerous than accepting uncertainty. Admitting a prophecy failed often means admitting that suffering has no clear explanation and that the future remains unpredictable and uncontrollable. For many people, uncertainty feels heavier than fear, because fear at least has a story, a shape, and a reason to exist. Instead of disappearing, belief reshapes itself, explaining that the message was symbolic, delayed, misunderstood, or meant for a different moment. These explanations protect people from feeling lost, allowing belief to continue without forcing painful self-doubt or emotional collapse. Belief survives because the emotional problem it solves continues even after predictions fail to materialize. Fear remains present in daily life, so belief adapts to keep that fear contained and meaningful. Another reason belief survives is that it connects people into groups that share meaning during difficult and confusing times. When people believe together, fear feels lighter because it becomes shared instead of carried alone. These groups offer routine, identity, and emotional safety when everyday life feels unstable or unfair. Leaving belief after a failure can mean losing community, direction, and belonging all at once. Many people quietly drift away after failed predictions, but those who remain often become more committed than before. Doubt removes itself naturally, leaving behind individuals who still need belief to make sense of their experience. Over time, groups may shrink, but shared certainty inside them often becomes stronger. History shows this pattern repeating across cultures, religions, and eras without significant variation. Failed prophecies rarely destroy belief because belief was never truly about the date itself. It was about explaining why life felt wrong, confusing, or out of balance in the first place. People are naturally skilled at connecting events into meaningful stories after they happen. When wars, disasters, or social changes continue, believers see them as confirmation rather than contradiction. This keeps emotional tension alive without requiring clear evidence or precise predictions. Even ordinary stress, inequality, and uncertainty can be interpreted as signs of larger collapse. Belief survives because it explains feelings rather than outcomes, and feelings remain real regardless of events. In simple terms, belief answers why life feels unstable, even when it cannot predict what comes next. This pattern does not exist because people are foolish, but because uncertainty is difficult to endure without explanation. Fear with a story feels safer than uncertainty without one. Failed prophecies remove a date, but they do not remove the emotional need that created belief. That is why endings are postponed instead of abandoned completely. The story continues because the feeling continues. And as long as the future feels uncertain, belief will keep finding new forms. When a prophecy about the end of the world fails, belief rarely disappears because fear does not vanish simply because a date has passed without visible consequences. For people already living with anxiety and instability, belief provides structure, and losing that structure can feel more dangerous than accepting uncertainty. Admitting a prophecy failed often means admitting that suffering has no clear explanation and that the future remains unpredictable and uncontrollable. For many people, uncertainty feels heavier than fear, because fear at least has a story, a shape, and a reason to exist. Instead of disappearing, belief reshapes itself, explaining that the message was symbolic, delayed, misunderstood, or meant for a different moment. These explanations protect people from feeling lost, allowing belief to continue without forcing painful self-doubt or emotional collapse. Belief survives because the emotional problem it solves continues even after predictions fail to materialize. Fear remains present in daily life, so belief adapts to keep that fear contained and meaningful. Another reason belief survives is that it connects people into groups that share meaning during difficult and confusing times. When people believe together, fear feels lighter because it becomes shared instead of carried alone. These groups offer routine, identity, and emotional safety when everyday life feels unstable or unfair. Leaving belief after a failure can mean losing community, direction, and belonging all at once. Many people quietly drift away after failed predictions, but those who remain often become more committed than before. Doubt removes itself naturally, leaving behind individuals who still need belief to make sense of their experience. Over time, groups may shrink, but shared certainty inside them often becomes stronger. History shows this pattern repeating across cultures, religions, and eras without significant variation. Failed prophecies rarely destroy belief because belief was never truly about the date itself. It was about explaining why life felt wrong, confusing, or out of balance in the first place. People are naturally skilled at connecting events into meaningful stories after they happen. When wars, disasters, or social changes continue, believers see them as confirmation rather than contradiction. This keeps emotional tension alive without requiring clear evidence or precise predictions. Even ordinary stress, inequality, and uncertainty can be interpreted as signs of larger collapse. Belief survives because it explains feelings rather than outcomes, and feelings remain real regardless of events. In simple terms, belief answers why life feels unstable, even when it cannot predict what comes next. This pattern does not exist because people are foolish, but because uncertainty is difficult to endure without explanation. Fear with a story feels safer than uncertainty without one. Failed prophecies remove a date, but they do not remove the emotional need that created belief. That is why endings are postponed instead of abandoned completely. The story continues because the feeling continues. And as long as the future feels uncertain, belief will keep finding new forms. Throughout history, the end of the world has been expected countless times, yet it never arrives in the way people imagine, even though the feeling itself refuses to disappear. This happens because the feeling is not created by dates or predictions, but by moments when life feels unstable, confusing, or emotionally overwhelming. When societies change faster than people can adapt, the mind interprets this as danger, even if no single event is truly catastrophic. The human brain is designed to look for clear conclusions, because unfinished uncertainty creates constant tension and mental fatigue. An ending promises relief, because it suggests that confusion, fear, and effort will eventually stop instead of continuing without explanation. When the ending does not arrive, the brain does not abandon the idea because the emotional pressure that created it still exists. Instead, the feeling goes quiet for a while, waiting for the next moment of instability to bring it back to the surface. History shows long periods where apocalyptic thinking fades, only to return suddenly during crisis, war, or rapid social change. Each return feels new to the people experiencing it, even though the pattern itself is ancient and well documented. The end never comes because societies adapt, restructure, and continue, but adaptation rarely feels calm while it is happening. Living through change feels chaotic, even if the outcome later appears stable in hindsight. People mistake the discomfort of transition for the certainty of collapse. This misunderstanding is reinforced by memory, which softens past crises while sharpening present ones. The past looks survivable only because its uncertainty has already ended. The present feels unbearable because its outcome is still unknown. This difference makes the feeling of an approaching end seem logical, even when history suggests otherwise. The idea of collapse provides emotional closure that real life rarely offers. Life continues without clean conclusions, and that frustrates the human need for order. Believing an ending is near creates a false sense of completion, even if nothing actually ends. The feeling returns because uncertainty never fully disappears from human life. As long as change exists, discomfort will follow, and the idea of an ending will remain tempting. This cycle repeats not because people forget history, but because emotion speaks louder than memory. Understanding this does not remove the feeling, but it explains why it keeps coming back. The end never arrives, but the feeling feels real every time. And that is why it continues to shape how humans see the future. Throughout history, the end of the world has been expected countless times, yet it never arrives in the way people imagine, even though the feeling itself refuses to disappear. This happens because the feeling is not created by dates or predictions, but by moments when life feels unstable, confusing, or emotionally overwhelming. When societies change faster than people can adapt, the mind interprets this as danger, even if no single event is truly catastrophic. The human brain is designed to look for clear conclusions, because unfinished uncertainty creates constant tension and mental fatigue. An ending promises relief, because it suggests that confusion, fear, and effort will eventually stop instead of continuing without explanation. When the ending does not arrive, the brain does not abandon the idea because the emotional pressure that created it still exists. Instead, the feeling goes quiet for a while, waiting for the next moment of instability to bring it back to the surface. History shows long periods where apocalyptic thinking fades, only to return suddenly during crisis, war, or rapid social change. Each return feels new to the people experiencing it, even though the pattern itself is ancient and well documented. The end never comes because societies adapt, restructure, and continue, but adaptation rarely feels calm while it is happening. Living through change feels chaotic, even if the outcome later appears stable in hindsight. People mistake the discomfort of transition for the certainty of collapse. This misunderstanding is reinforced by memory, which softens past crises while sharpening present ones. The past looks survivable only because its uncertainty is already ended. The present feels unbearable because its outcome is still unknown. This difference makes the feeling of an approaching end seem logical, even when history suggests otherwise. The idea of collapse provides emotional closure that real life rarely offers. Life continues without clean conclusions, and that frustrates the human need for order. Believing an ending is near creates a false sense of completion, even if nothing actually ends. The feeling returns because uncertainty never fully disappears from human life. As long as change exists, discomfort will follow, and the idea of an ending will remain tempting. This cycle repeats not because people forget history, but because emotion speaks louder than memory. Understanding this does not remove the feeling, but it explains why it keeps coming back. The end never arrives, but the feeling feels real every time. And that is why it continues to shape how humans see the future. Humans have always preferred stories with clear endings because endings feel easier to understand than open situations that never fully resolve. When something ends, the mind can rest, knowing that no more decisions are required and no uncertainty remains. Open futures demand constant attention and adaptation, forcing people to live without knowing whether their effort will succeed or fail. This ongoing uncertainty creates mental fatigue, making everyday life feel heavier than it actually is. Final stories offer emotional relief because they promise closure where reality offers none. Even a tragic ending can feel comforting compared to a future that never explains itself. Throughout history, people created stories about endings not because they wanted destruction, but because they wanted clarity in moments when life felt confusing and directionless. An ending suggests that suffering has a limit, while an open future suggests that discomfort could continue indefinitely without resolution or meaning. This is why apocalyptic stories feel attractive during unstable times, even when people do not truly want the world to end. The idea of a final moment simplifies complexity, turning many problems into one conclusion that feels understandable and contained. Without a final story, people must accept that life continues without guarantees, which is emotionally harder than believing everything is moving toward a clear outcome. Open futures require patience, trust, and tolerance for uncertainty, qualities that are difficult to maintain during crisis. Final stories remove responsibility by suggesting that events are inevitable rather than shaped by human choices and slow change. This makes endings feel comforting because they reduce pressure to fix what feels broken or overwhelming. Humans return to final stories again and again, not because they are accurate, but because they feel emotionally complete. Fear of the unknown has always been one of the strongest forces shaping human belief, because uncertainty creates tension that the mind cannot easily ignore or silence. When people do not understand what comes next, imagination fills the empty space, often creating explanations that feel more emotional than logical. The unknown feels dangerous because it removes the ability to prepare, leaving people exposed to possibilities they cannot control or predict. Humans can endure pain, loss, and hardship when they know what to expect, but they struggle deeply when outcomes remain hidden. This is why uncertainty often feels heavier than bad news, even when that news describes something frightening or difficult. Belief steps in as a way to organize uncertainty, giving fear a shape, a reason, and a story that feels manageable. A clear explanation, even a dark one, feels safer than endless questions without answers. Throughout history, moments of rapid change increased fear of the unknown, making belief systems grow stronger rather than weaker. When familiar rules stopped working, people searched for meaning that went beyond everyday experience. Belief offered a sense of order when the world felt unpredictable and unstable. Fear became easier to live with when it felt shared, named, and understood within a larger story. This is why belief often spreads fastest during crisis rather than during long periods of calm. The unknown does not only threaten survival, but identity, because people lose confidence in who they are and where they belong. Belief restores identity by placing individuals inside a meaningful structure rather than leaving them alone with doubt. Even beliefs that predict disaster can feel comforting if they explain why life feels uncertain. The mind prefers a complete story to an open question, even if that story describes something negative. Uncertainty demands constant attention, while belief allows emotional rest by offering conclusions. This emotional relief explains why people hold on to belief even when evidence weakens. Fear of the unknown also pushes people toward groups, because shared belief reduces isolation. When many people fear together, fear feels lighter and less personal. Belief creates shared language for discomfort, allowing people to talk about anxiety without feeling alone. Over time, belief becomes less about prediction and more about emotional survival. The unknown never disappears from human life because change is constant and the future always remains partly hidden. As long as uncertainty exists, belief will continue to form around it. Humans do not seek belief because they reject reality, but because they seek balance inside it. Fear asks questions faster than logic can answer. Belief exists to slow those questions down. And as long as the unknown remains, belief will remain close behind it. Fear of the unknown has always been one of the strongest forces shaping human belief, because uncertainty creates constant inner tension that the mind cannot easily ignore or silence. When people do not understand what comes next, imagination naturally fills the empty space, often creating explanations that feel emotionally convincing even when they are not fully logical. The unknown feels dangerous because it removes the ability to prepare, leaving people exposed to outcomes they cannot predict, control, or meaningfully influence. Humans can endure pain, loss, and hardship when they know what to expect, but they struggle deeply when outcomes remain hidden and unclear. This is why uncertainty often feels heavier than bad news, even when that news describes something frightening or difficult to accept. Belief steps in as a way to organize uncertainty, giving fear a shape, a reason, and a story that feels manageable. A clear explanation, even a dark one, often feels safer than endless questions without answers or direction. Throughout history, moments of rapid change increased fear of the unknown, causing belief systems to grow stronger rather than weaker. When familiar rules stopped working, people searched for meaning that went beyond daily experience and practical explanation. Belief offered a sense of order when the world felt unpredictable, unstable, and difficult to understand. Fear became easier to live with when it felt shared, named, and understood within a larger story. This is why belief often spreads fastest during crisis rather than during long periods of calm and stability. The unknown does not only threaten survival, but identity, because people lose confidence in who they are and where they belong. Belief restores identity by placing individuals inside a meaningful structure instead of leaving them alone with doubt. Even beliefs that predict disaster can feel comforting if they explain why life feels uncertain and heavy. The mind prefers a complete story to an open question, even if that story describes something negative or frightening. Uncertainty demands constant attention, while belief allows emotional rest by offering conclusions. This emotional relief explains why people hold on to belief even when evidence weakens over time. Fear of the unknown also pushes people toward groups because shared belief reduces isolation and personal burden. When many people fear together, fear feels lighter and less personal than when carried alone. Belief creates a shared language for discomfort, allowing people to talk about anxiety without feeling exposed. Over time, belief becomes less about prediction and more about emotional survival. The unknown never disappears from human life because change is constant and the future always remains partly hidden. Humans have always searched for signs because uncertainty feels unbearable without clues, and signs offer the feeling that the world is communicating instead of remaining silent. When life feels unstable, people become more attentive to small details, believing meaning hides in patterns they might otherwise ignore during calm periods. A strange dream, an unusual animal, or a sudden coincidence can feel important when the future feels unclear and emotionally heavy. This behavior is not superstition alone, but a natural response to fear because the mind wants guidance when direction feels lost. Signs suggest that events are connected, which feels safer than believing chaos exists without structure or reason. Ancient cultures read signs in the sky, weather, and behavior of animals, believing nature reflected hidden messages about what was coming. These interpretations help people feel prepared, even if preparation was symbolic rather than practical. Searching for signs also gave people a sense of participation, as if paying attention could influence outcomes. When signs seemed to appear before disasters, memory reinforced belief, even if many signs were noticed without consequence. The mind remembers matches and forgets misses, strengthening trust in patterns over time. This selective memory made signs feel reliable, even when they were random or coincidental. During crisis, people scan their environment constantly, turning ordinary events into warnings or confirmations. This habit increases anxiety, but also provides emotional focus when everything feels overwhelming. Signs feel comforting because they imply the future is readable, even if only partially. A readable future feels less threatening than a future that offers no hints at all. This is why people search for meaning in numbers, dates, and repeating symbols during unstable times. Calendars, cycles, and anniversaries become emotionally charged, suggesting time itself carries messages. Even modern societies search for signs through trends, headlines, and online patterns that feel larger than coincidence. Technology has changed where signs are found, but not the need to find them. People now read markets, algorithms, and social shifts the same way ancient people read stars and storms. The desire is the same, to feel that uncertainty has shape and direction. Searching for signs does not remove fear, but it makes fear feel navigable. As long as the future feels unclear, humans will continue to search for meaning everywhere they look. During periods of crisis, coincidences begin to feel heavier and more important than they normally would, because the human mind becomes highly sensitive to anything that might reduce uncertainty and emotional tension. When life feels stable, coincidences usually pass unnoticed, but when familiar routines break, the mind treats them as possible clues about hidden connections in the world. This happens because the brain is searching for order, and coincidences suggest that events are linked together rather than scattered randomly without explanation or meaning. A repeated number, a familiar phrase, or an unexpected meeting can suddenly feel important when the future feels unclear and emotionally overwhelming. The mind prefers to believe that something is guiding events rather than accepting that chaos might exist without direction or purpose. Coincidences feel meaningful because they hint that the world still follows patterns, even if those patterns are difficult to see or understand clearly. In ancient times, people found meaning in repeated natural events, believing nature itself was communicating warnings or guidance through signs. When storms followed rituals or disasters followed unusual omens, memory connected those moments into a single story that felt intentional. Matches between signs and events were remembered strongly, while moments without meaning faded quietly into the background. This selective memory strengthened belief in coincidences over time, making them feel reliable even when many led nowhere. During crisis, attention narrows, causing people to notice small details they would normally ignore during calm periods. Every coincidence becomes emotionally louder because the mind is already under pressure and searching for reassurance. Coincidences also reduce isolation because sharing them creates connection and a sense of shared understanding. When many people notice the same patterns, belief feels stronger and less personal, turning coincidence into confirmation. Modern life has not removed this instinct, but shifted where coincidences are found and how they are interpreted. People now search for meaning in headlines, numbers, trends, and online patterns that feel too aligned to ignore. The emotional response remains the same, even if the symbols and environments have changed. Coincidences feel meaningful because they offer direction when direction feels lost. They suggest the future might be readable, even if only in fragments. A future that feels readable is less frightening than one that offers no hints at all. This is why coincidences grow powerful during unstable times rather than peaceful ones. They do not predict what will happen next, but they make uncertainty feel manageable. As long as crisis and uncertainty exist, coincidences will continue to feel important to the human mind. During unstable periods, many people begin to feel as if history itself is watching them, as if their lives are unfolding inside a larger moment that will later be judged or remembered. This feeling appears when events seem unusually intense or fast, making ordinary days feel like they carry more weight than usual. People start to sense that they are living through a turning point, even if they cannot clearly explain what is changing or why it feels so important. History stops feeling distant and academic, and instead feels close, personal, and actively unfolding around everyday life. This happens because the mind searches for context when uncertainty grows, and history offers a framework larger than individual experience. By placing themselves inside a historical moment, people feel their struggles have meaning beyond personal failure or bad luck. Wars, crises, and sudden social shifts often trigger this sensation because they resemble events previously described in history books. When the present starts to resemble the past, the mind assumes a similar outcome must be approaching. This creates the impression that history follows scripts and that certain stages always lead to endings or transformations. People begin comparing their time to famous collapses, golden ages, or dramatic turning points they have heard about. These comparisons make the present feel heavier because history carries emotional weight and moral judgment. Feeling watched by history can increase anxiety, but it can also provide comfort by suggesting that confusion is part of a known pattern. If others before survived similar moments, then survival feels possible again. At the same time, this feeling can exaggerate importance, making everyday events seem more dramatic than they truly are. The present feels larger than life because it is measured against centuries rather than personal memory. This is why people often say they are living through history, even when outcomes remain uncertain. The feeling does not come from evidence but from emotional alignment with past stories of change and crisis. History becomes a mirror reflecting fear, hope, and expectation back onto the present moment. As long as instability continues, this sense of being watched by history remains strong. It fades only when life becomes predictable enough to feel ordinary again. Until then, the present continues to feel unusually significant. And significance makes people search even harder for meaning. When uncertainty lasts too long, people often begin to describe it as destiny, because destiny feels easier to accept than randomness without explanation or direction. Calling events destiny suggests that outcomes were always meant to happen, which removes the pressure of responsibility and the pain of unanswered questions. During unstable times, this idea feels comforting, because it frames confusion as part of a larger path rather than a series of meaningless accidents. Destiny turns fear into expectation, allowing people to endure hardship by believing it leads somewhere specific instead of nowhere at all. Ancient cultures often describe destiny as something written, woven, or decided by forces beyond human reach, giving uncertainty a clear source. This belief reduced anxiety, because if events were destined, then struggling against them felt unnecessary and exhausting. Even negative outcomes felt easier to accept when they were seen as unavoidable, rather than the result of chaos or poor choices. Destiny also created emotional distance from fear because it shifted focus from immediate danger to long-term meaning. People stopped asking why something happened and started asking what it was meant to teach or prepare them for. This shift replaced panic with patience, even when conditions remained harsh and unpredictable. Turning uncertainty into destiny also strengthened social bonds because shared belief created a sense of collective journey. Groups felt they were moving together through a defined story instead of facing isolated problems alone. Modern life has not removed this instinct, but reshaped it into ideas about fate, timelines, or historical necessity. People still say events were inevitable when outcomes feel too complex or overwhelming to fully understand. Destiny offers emotional relief by suggesting that confusion has limits, even when reality provides none. It simplifies the future into something that feels already decided, reducing the mental strain of endless possibility. This does not mean people stop acting, but that action feels guided rather than desperate. Destiny feels safer than uncertainty because it promises coherence instead of silence. As long as the future feels unclear, humans will continue turning uncertainty into destiny. Not because it predicts reality, but because it protects the mind from feeling lost. And when the mind feels protected, fear becomes easier to carry forward. Across history, humans have often believed that all confusion, fear, and struggle will eventually lead to one final moment where everything becomes clear and meaningful at once. Living inside constant change is mentally exhausting, especially when effort does not bring visible results, making the idea of a final resolution feel deeply comforting. A single decisive moment promises rest, understanding, and emotional relief after long periods of uncertainty and confusion that seem to have no clear direction. This expectation appears in myths, religions, and philosophies that describe a turning point where the old world ends and a new order finally begins. People imagine this moment not because they want destruction, but because they want meaning to arrive clearly instead of slowly and unpredictably. Gradual improvement is difficult to notice during hardship, while a dramatic change feels powerful, memorable, and emotionally satisfying. History reinforces this expectation by focusing on collapses, revolutions, and discoveries, while long periods of adaptation are rarely remembered or celebrated. This creates the illusion that history moves through sudden breaks, even though most change actually happens quietly over time. Humans then project this pattern forward, expecting one final moment that will explain everything that came before it. The idea of a decisive change also reduces responsibility, because it suggests waiting is more important than acting during uncertainty. If everything will be resolved later, confusion in the present feels easier to tolerate. This belief becomes especially strong during periods when progress feels slow, fragile, or reversed entirely. A final moment restores hope by promising that current struggle will not continue forever without explanation. Even repeated disappointment does not erase this expectation, because the promise itself provides emotional stability. When one decisive change does not arrive, the idea is often moved forward rather than abandoned. The mind prefers postponing resolution to accepting that life continues without clean endings. This is why humans repeatedly imagine one final turning point that will change everything at once. It feels easier to believe in a decisive future than to accept many uncertain tomorrows. This expectation does not come from evidence, but from emotional fatigue shaped by prolonged instability. Humans are drawn to conclusions because conclusions promise relief from constant adaptation. Yet history shows that change rarely arrives all at once or on a single clear date. Instead, it unfolds unevenly, quietly, and without obvious signals. Understanding this does not remove the desire for a final moment, but it explains why the desire never disappears. As long as life feels unresolved, the idea of one last change will remain tempting. And that idea will continue shaping how humans imagine the future, even when the future refuses to end. Throughout history, the world has never truly ended, yet humans continue to expect it, because expectation feels easier than accepting that life moves forward without final conclusions. The idea of an ending offers emotional simplicity, while reality offers ongoing change that demands patience, effort, and constant adjustment. When people feel exhausted by uncertainty, the thought of a final moment feels like rest, even if that rest is imagined as dramatic or destructive. An ending suggests that struggle has meaning, because it leads somewhere definite instead of stretching endlessly into the unknown. This is why predictions of collapse return during every major crisis, even when previous predictions clearly failed. The mind remembers the feeling of fear more strongly than the failure of the prediction itself. Each generation experiences uncertainty as new, even though the pattern is ancient and well documented. People believe they are living at the edge of history because the present always feels louder than the past. The past appears stable only because its uncertainty has already been resolved by time. The present feels unbearable because its outcome is still open and unfinished. Expecting an ending turns open fear into something defined, which feels emotionally safer. It replaces endless questions with one powerful conclusion that seems to explain everything. This expectation also removes pressure from individuals because it suggests forces larger than personal choice are in control. If the world is ending, personal failure feels less significant and easier to forgive. Believing in an ending can feel comforting during times when effort does not seem to improve life. History shows that societies rarely collapse all at once, but transform through long, uneven processes. Those processes feel chaotic from the inside, even when they later appear orderly in hindsight. Humans confuse the discomfort of transformation with the certainty of collapse. The world never ends because people adapt, rebuild, and reorganize, even when systems fail. What ends are specific ways of living, thinking, and organizing society. New forms replace old ones, often quietly and without dramatic moments. Yet the expectation of a final ending survives because it answers emotional needs rather than factual ones. It gives fear a clear shape and uncertainty a deadline. As long as life continues to change faster than people feel comfortable with, the idea of an ending will return. Not because the world is fragile, but because the human mind seeks closure. The world continues, but humans keep waiting for a final page that never arrives. And that waiting quietly shapes how people imagine both the present and the future. In the end, stories about endings are not really about the world collapsing, but about humans trying to understand themselves during moments of uncertainty and emotional pressure. When life feels unstable, people reach for explanations that feel large enough to match their fear, even if those explanations describe dramatic or final outcomes. The world does not need to end for people to feel lost, overwhelmed, or disconnected from meaning. These feelings arise naturally whenever change moves faster than understanding, and history shows this has happened many times before. Humans have always lived inside unfinished stories, even when they believed they were approaching the last chapter. What changes is not the world itself, but how people experience it from the inside. Fear, belief, destiny, signs, and endings are tools the mind uses to stay balanced when certainty disappears. They are not flaws, but survival strategies shaped over thousands of years. The desire for a final moment comes from exhaustion, not destruction. It reflects a wish for clarity, rest, and understanding rather than an actual desire for collapse. History continues because people adapt, even when adaptation feels painful, confusing, or slow. The future never fully reveals itself, but life moves forward anyway. This has always been true, even when it felt impossible to those living through change. Understanding this does not remove fear, but it softens it. It reminds us that uncertainty is not a sign of ending, but a condition of being human. The world does not end, yet the feeling returns again and again. And each time, humanity continues quietly forward, writing new chapters without ever seeing the final page. While people talk about endings, most of human life has always unfolded far away from prophecies, theories, and dramatic expectations about the future. Ordinary people rarely lived as if the world was about to end, even when others loudly predicted collapse around them. They focused on daily tasks, relationships, and small decisions that made life bearable, even during unstable or dangerous times. History remembers disasters and predictions, but it is built on ordinary days that continued without clear answers. People cooked meals, fixed tools, raised children, and planned for tomorrow, even when tomorrow felt uncertain. This quiet routine acted as a counterbalance to fear, grounding life in what could be controlled. Predictions existed at the edges of society, while daily survival existed at the center. Most humans did not wait for final moments to arrive before living. They adapted habits instead of surrendering to fear, adjusting life slowly rather than expecting sudden endings. This behavior repeated across cultures, centuries, and crises, regardless of belief systems or prophecies. Even during war, famine, or collapse, ordinary life never fully stopped. It changed shape, slowed down, or became harder, but it continued. This continuation is why the world never ends in the way people imagine. Life does not require certainty to move forward. It only requires people to keep choosing small actions despite incomplete understanding. Ordinary life survives because it does not depend on predictions being correct. It exists independently of fear, quietly carrying humanity through every imagined ending. The future has never felt complete or secure to the people living inside it, no matter which century they belong to. Every generation believed they stood at a moment of transition, sensing that something important was changing beyond their control. This feeling is not unique to modern life, but part of how humans experience time while living through it. The future always feels unfinished because it is experienced without hindsight. People cannot see outcomes while they are still unfolding, which makes every present moment feel unstable. Only later does history turn confusion into narrative and uncertainty into explanation. What feels overwhelming now often appears inevitable later. This delay creates the illusion that the past was calmer, clearer, and more stable than the present. In reality, past generations felt the same uncertainty, but their doubts are no longer remembered. They lived inside unfinished futures just as people do now. The feeling that something is missing, unresolved, or approaching has always accompanied human life. It does not signal collapse, but transition. The future feels unfinished because it always is. And humans move through it not by knowing where it leads, but by continuing anyway. This has never changed. And it is the quiet reason humanity remains, long after every predicted ending is past.